am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Midnight Echo.
The village of Lichgate on the Hill was, by all accounts, a place where time had been politely requested to stand still, and it had seen fit to comply. On this particular Tuesday in June, the sun hung like a polished brass plate over the village green, casting long golden shadows across the stone facade of the newly renovated parish hall. It was an afternoon of high importance. The grand reopening was to be marked by a ceremonial tea, a speech by the local benefactor, and most importantly, the judging of the Sultana cake competition. Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner of the hall, her knitting needles clicking a soft rhythmic staccato. To the casual observer, she was merely another elderly lady in a faded tweed suit and a hat adorned with a slightly wilted artificial rose. Her eyes, however, pale blue and remarkably clear, were far from idle. They flitted from the harried vicar's wife, who was struggling with a temperamental tea urn, to the local doctor, who was surreptitiously checking his watch. "It's a lovely turnout, isn't it, Jane?" chirped Mrs. Price Ridley, settling into the chair beside her with the heavy sigh of a woman who carried the weight of the parish's moral standards on her shoulders. "Indeed, Clara," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I couldn't help but notice that Colonel Pendergast looks particularly out of sorts today. He reminds me so much of poor Mr. Henderson, the one who had that unfortunate business with the disputed boundary hedge back in St. Mary Mead. A very litigious temperament. The Colonel was, at that moment, the centre of gravity in the room, a tall, craggy man with a moustache that looked like a startled badger. Colonel Arthur Pendergast was the village's resident autocrat. He had funded the hall's roof repairs, a fact he ensured no one forgot. "He's always out of sorts," Mrs. Price Ridley whispered, leaning in. "He's had a terrible row with young Julian Thorne, the architect, you know. Something about the drainage. And then there's that niece of his, Eleanor. Such a flighty girl. He's threatened to cut her off at least 3 times this month." Miss Marple nodded absently. She watched as Eleanor, a pale girl with anxious eyes, approached her uncle with a porcelain cup. The Colonel took it without a word of thanks, his face a mottled shade of purple. He stepped onto the small wooden dais, clearing his throat with a sound like gravel in a blender. "Friends, neighbours," the Colonel began, his voice booming through the rafters. "Lichgate has always stood for tradition. This hall represents our resilience." He paused, taking a long, deep gulp of his tea. Miss Marple noticed a slight twitch in his left eyelid. It reminded her of the time the village postmaster had accidentally swallowed a wasp. The Colonel continued, but his voice had lost its vigour. We must ensure that the values of the past are not poisoned by—" He stopped abruptly. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the parquet floor with a sharp crystalline crack. The brown liquid splattered across his polished brogues. For a heartbeat the room was silent. Then the Colonel's hands flew to his throat. His face shifted from purple to a terrifying dusky grey. He took one staggering step forward, his eyes wide and fixed on something, or someone, at the back of the hall. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp emerged. Then, with the heavy finality of a felled oak, he collapsed over the table of competition cakes. The scream that followed came from Eleanor, a high, thin sound that broke the paralysis of the crowd. Dr. Haydock pushed his way through the throng, kneeling beside the fallen man. The vicar hovered nearby, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. Miss Marple stayed in her seat, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her gaze was not on the body but on the floor. Beside the shattered remnants of the teacup lay a small, dark object that had rolled away under a chair, a single shriveled sultana. "Is he—" the vicar began, his voice trembling. Dr. Haydock stood up slowly, his expression grim. He looked at the remains of the tea and then at the silent, watching faces of the villagers. He's gone. And I'm afraid, Vicar, that this was no heart attack. The scent of Earl Grey and floor wax hung heavy in the air, suddenly cloying. In the corner, Miss Marple sighed softly. It was going to be a very long afternoon, and she couldn't help but think of the similarity to the case of the old chemist's wife, where the secret had been hidden, quite literally, in plain sight. The silence that followed Dr. Haydock's pronouncement was not the silence of peace, but the held breath of a room suddenly aware that a predator had moved among them. It lasted only a few seconds before the dam broke, and the parish hall dissolved into a frantic hum of activity. The vicar, looking as though he might follow the colonel into a faint, began ushering the more hysterical parishioners toward the door, while Mrs. Price Ridley took it upon herself to guard the remains of the competition cakes, as if they were evidence in a Crown Court, which, Miss Marple noted with a sharp glint in her eye, they very well might be. Poor Arthur, Mrs. Price Ridley whispered, though her voice carried quite effectively to the 3 nearest rows of chairs. A stroke, surely? He was always so high-strung. I told him the stress of the renovation would be his undoing, and the way he argued with that Thorn boy this morning, enough to burst a blood vessel in a much younger man. Miss Marple, who had quietly moved a few inches closer to the dais, under the guise of retrieving a dropped ball of grey wool, caught the eye of Julian Thorn. The young architect was standing by the window, his face a mask of pale composure that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was twisting a silver signet ring on his finger, a nervous habit that Miss Marple catalogued alongside her memories of a certain Mr. Ebbsfleet who had once tried to forge a codicil to his aunt's will. "A stroke is a very convenient thing, Clara," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to the shattered teacup. But Dr. Haydock seemed quite specific, and the colonel's face, it reminded me so much of poor Mrs. Gable's gardener after he accidentally ingested those nightshade berries, a very particular shade of grey-blue. The arrival of Sergeant Miller from the local station provided a focal point for the mounting tension. He was a sturdy, unimaginative man who viewed crime as a series of boxes to be checked, and he looked thoroughly annoyed that a grand opening had turned into a crime scene. He began the laborious process of taking names, his heavy boots echoing on the parquet floor as he cordially but firmly forbid anyone from leaving the hall just yet. This decree acted as a catalyst for the village's favourite pastime, the dissection of character. Groups formed like eddies in a stream. By the tea urn the gossip was already fermenting. "It's the niece I feel for," whispered Miss Hartnell, the village's most prolific distributor of charitable tracts and unasked-for advice. "Eleanor has been a saint, staying in that draughty manor house catering to his every whim, but they say he was going to change the will. Again, he was never satisfied, you know. He thought she was seeing that boy from the garage, the one with the motorbike. I heard it was the drainage," countered Mrs. Danvers, the vicar's wife, her voice trembling slightly. "Julian Thorn was seen shouting at the colonel behind the vestry only an hour ago, something about the foundation costs being over budget. The colonel threatened to ruin his career, to tell the Royal Institute that Thorn was incompetent." Miss Marple listened to these fragments of truth and half-truth, weaving them into the tapestry of village life she knew so well. She observed Eleanor Pendergast, who was sitting on a folding chair near the back, being comforted by the local district nurse. The girl wasn't weeping, she was staring at her hands, which were stained with a small splash of the spilled tea. There was a look of profound shock on her face, but beneath it, Miss Marple sensed a flicker of something else. Was it relief? Or perhaps the sudden, terrifying realization of a door swinging open? "It's the tea, of course," Mrs. Price Ridley asserted, having moved back to Miss Marple's side. "I saw her bring it to him. She looked as white as a sheet even then. And did you see how he took it? Almost as if he didn't trust her. Oh, it's a terrible thing to say, but money does strange things to people, Jane. We all know the Pendergast estate is worth a fortune, even if the Colonel lived like a miser. Money is indeed a powerful motive, Clara, Miss Marple agreed mildly. But so is pride, and the Colonel had a great deal of that. He couldn't bear to be wrong. Her eyes returned to the floor. The sergeant was busy questioning Julian Thorne, whose voice was rising in defensive indignation. No one was looking at the debris. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and, with a nimbleness that defied her years, bent down. Her lace-trimmed handkerchief fluttered for a moment over the floor. When she straightened, the shriveled sultana she had noticed earlier was gone, safely nestled in the folds of her linen. She looked at it closely for a split second before tucking the handkerchief into her handbag. It wasn't just a dried fruit. There was a peculiar sticky residue on it, and it lacked the plumpness of the others she had seen in the competition cakes on the table. It looked treated. "The police will handle it, I'm sure," Miss Marple said to no one in particular, her voice returning to its usual gentle, slightly dithering tone. "Though they do tend to focus on the obvious, don't they? It's like the time the churchwarden's cat went missing. Everyone blamed the butcher's dog because they had a history of quarrelling, but it turned out the cat had simply found a much more comfortable cushion in the organ loft." Dr. Haydock approached her then, wiping his brow. He had known Miss Marple for years and had a healthy respect for what he called her unusual associations. "A bad business, Jane," he said quietly. "I've sent for the forensics team from the city. I don't like the look of it, not one bit." "No, Arthur," Miss Marple replied, using the doctor's Christian name. "It is a very ugly business, but then Lichgate has always had its shadows, hasn't it? We just prefer to cover them with a nice bit of lace." As the sergeant began directing people into the small vestry for formal statements, the sun continued to shine mockingly through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the body of the man who had, until 10 minutes ago, been the master of all he surveyed. Miss Marple sat back, her needles starting up again, click, 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 as she waited her turn to be questioned, her mind already sorting through the inhabitants of the village like a gardener sorting through a tray of potentially blighted seedlings. The vestry was a cramped, sombre room smelling of damp hymnals and furniture polish, and it was here that Sergeant Miller had established his temporary headquarters. One by one, the villagers were summoned from the main hall, returning moments later with faces either flushed with indignation or pale with the gravity of the situation. When Miss Marple's turn finally arrived, she entered with a small, apologetic smile, her knitting bag clutched firmly in her hands. Sergeant Miller looked up from his notebook, suppressing a sigh. He knew Miss Marple by reputation, a lady who was often present when unpleasant things happened, and who possessed a tiresome habit of comparing grave crimes to trivial village mishaps. "Now then, Miss Marple," he began, his pen poised, "I don't want to keep you long. You were sitting near the Colonel when he took the tea. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone approaching the cup before the niece handed it to him?" Miss Marple settled herself into the hard wooden chair, smoothing her skirts. "It is so kind of you to be concerned, Sergeant. It was a very distressing sight. It reminded me so much of poor Mr. Gregson's prize-winning terrier, the one that got into the snail bait. The same suddenness, you see." Miller cleared his throat. "Quite. But about the tea, Miss Marple?" "The tea was poured by Mrs. Danvers, our dear vicar's wife," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "She was quite harried, poor soul. The urn was leaking, you know. Then Eleanor took the cup. But what struck me as most peculiar, and do stop me if this is quite irrelevant, was the sugar bowl. It was passed along the front row by Mr. Thorne before Eleanor reached the Colonel. Julian Thorne seemed quite insistent that the Colonel should have his tea exactly as he liked it. The sergeant made a quick note, his eyebrows knitting together. "Thorne, you say? The architect? There's no love lost there. We've already had reports of their disagreement over the building costs." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. But then, people often argue about money when they are really arguing about something else entirely. It's like the Baxter sisters and the ornamental bird bath. They fought for years over the placement, but the real issue was a shared affection for the same curate 40 years prior. Human nature is so very consistent. As she spoke, her eyes wandered to the small window that looked out onto the back of the parish hall. She saw Julian Thorne standing near the old lich gate, his head bent close to Eleanor Pendergast's. They weren't speaking like a grieving niece and a sympathetic professional. There was a tautness in their posture, a shared intensity that suggested a deep, perhaps dangerous alliance. "Is there anything else?" Miller asked, his tone signaling that he had heard enough about the Baxters and their bird bath. "Only that the Colonel seemed to expect something bitter," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping a fraction in pitch. Before he drank, he looked at the cup with such a look of, well, I can only describe it as grim resignation, as if he knew he was being forced to swallow a very unpleasant truth. When she was released, Miss Marple did not immediately join the exodus of villagers heading home to their evening meals and their telephones. Instead, she lingered in the corridor, her presence as unobtrusive as the shadows. She watched as Dr. Haydock emerged from the hall, looking tired. "The sergeant thinks it was the tea," Haydock said, pausing beside her. "He's already sent the cup fragments off. He's convinced Eleanor or Thorne slipped something into it. It's the obvious conclusion, Jane. The motive is there. Inheritance for the girl, the removal of a professional threat for the boy." "The obvious is often true, Arthur," Miss Marple replied, her fingers tracing the lace border of the handkerchief in her pocket, feeling the hard lump of the sultana within. "But it lacks finesse. Why do it so publicly? Why at the very moment of his triumph? To kill a man in a room full of witnesses requires either great desperation or a very clever distraction." She looked back toward the cake table, which was now being draped in a white sheet by a somber constable. The competition had been forgotten, the efforts of the village bakers rendered moot by death. "I noticed something, Arthur," she continued softly. "When the Colonel fell, he didn't just collapse, he reached out. He seemed to be trying to point at the cakes. Everyone assumed he was clutching the table for support, but his finger was quite specifically directed at the third entry, Mrs. Benson's fruitcake." Dr. Haydock frowned. "Mrs. Benson? The widow from the cottage by the stream? She's a harmless creature, Jane. She spends all her time with her roses." "Precisely," Miss Marple murmured. "And roses, as you know, require a great deal of specialized care. Many of the treatments for aphids and black spot are quite potent. It reminds me of the time the village apothecary's daughter decided to take up watercolor painting. She was so careful with her brushes, but she never realized how much of the pigment ended up on her fingertips." As they walked out into the cooling evening air, the village green looked deceptively peaceful. But for Miss Marple, the patterns were beginning to emerge, tiny, jagged pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet form a whole. She knew that tonight, behind the drawn curtains of the cottages, the whispers would be frantic. Secrets that had been kept for decades would be weighed against the fear of the hangman's noose, and she also knew that the shriveled, sticky fruit in her pocket held a secret that the police, in their rush for the obvious, would likely never even look for. The following morning, Lichgate on the Hill awoke to a silence that felt heavy and expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. The dew was still thick on the village green when Sergeant Miller, accompanied by a sharp-eyed detective inspector named Slack, who had been dispatched from the county headquarters, made his way toward the Pendergast Manor. The village, usually a hive of quiet industry by 8 o'clock, seemed to be watching from behind its twitching lace curtains. Miss Marple was among the early risers, though her activity appeared entirely innocuous. She was busily deadheading the geraniums in the window boxes of her rented cottage, a task that afforded her a perfect view of the road leading to the manor. She watched the police car disappear up the long gravel drive, her needles of thought clicking as rapidly as her knitting ones had the night before. By 10 o'clock, the village was no longer merely whispering. It was shouting through the medium of the Morning Post and the Exchange at the butcher's. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose thirst for information was second only to her desire to be the first to share it, found Miss Marple at the latch gate of the church, ostensibly admiring the stone carvings. "They've found it, Jane," Mrs. Price Ridley hissed, her breath puffing in the cool morning air. "I had it from the vicar's maid, who heard it from the constable's wife. They found a bottle of that stuff, in the architect's briefcase. Julian Thorne, just as I suspected. He was seen leaving the hall for a few minutes before the tea was served, supposedly to fetch more blueprints from his car. But it's clear now, isn't it? He was fetching his insurance policy against the Colonel's threats." Miss Marple snipped a stray thread from her glove, her expression one of mild, puzzled interest. "A bottle, Clara? How very definitive. It reminds me so much of the time young Tommy Bond was accused of stealing the choir boy's marmalade. They found the jar right in his satchel, you see. Everyone was quite satisfied." "And was he guilty?" Mrs. Price Ridley asked, momentarily distracted. "Oh, heavens, no," Miss Marple replied. "It had been put there by the real culprit, a very vindictive little girl named Sarah, who didn't like the way Tommy played the mouth organ. She knew exactly where the search would begin. But tell me, what does the inspector say about poor Eleanor?" Mrs. Price Ridley's face darkened with a mix of pity and suspicion. "The girl is a wreck, they say. But the sergeant found a letter in her desk, a draft of a letter, really, to that mechanic she's been seeing. It spoke of ending the tyranny and finally being free to live. It looks very black for both of them, Jane. The police believe they were in it together. The architect provides the means and the niece provides the opportunity, a classic conspiracy. It was indeed the story that the police were rapidly assembling. Inspector Slack was not a man for nuance. He liked motives that could be measured in pounds and pence. To him, the case was as clear as the summer sky. Julian Thorne was facing professional ruin and bankruptcy if the Colonel exposed his financial mismanagement of the Hall's funds, and Eleanor Pendergast was a young woman in love with a man her uncle despised, standing to inherit a fortune that would buy her freedom. Miss Marple, however, remained troubled by a very different set of details. She left Mrs. Price Ridley and took a slow, deliberate stroll toward the back of the parish hall. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, but the back garden, where the competition entrants had parked their cars and unloaded their goods, remained accessible. She stood for a moment near the compost heap, her eyes sweeping over the ground. She wasn't looking for bottles or letters, she was looking at the flora. The village of Lichgate was famous for its gardens, but the Colonel had been particularly proud of his prize-winning oleanders, which he had donated to the parish hall's landscaping only the previous month. As she walked, she encountered Mrs. Benson. The widow was dressed in her gardening smock, clutching a basket of cuttings. She looked frailer than usual, her hands trembling as she adjusted her sun hat. "A terrible thing, Miss Marple," Mrs. Benson said, her voice a thin reed. "To think such wickedness could happen here. The inspector spoke to me this morning. He asked so many questions about the cakes. He seemed to think someone might have tampered with the ingredients." "It is a natural line of inquiry, I suppose," Miss Marple said gently. "Your fruit cake looked lovely, Myra. Such a rich, dark colour. I've always wondered, do you use the old recipe, the one with the soaked fruit?" Mrs. Benson nodded vaguely. "Yes. Soaked for 48 hours. It's the only way to get the proper texture. But now, I don't think I shall ever want to bake again, to have my entry associated with such a tragedy." "It is very distressing," Miss Marple agreed. "But you know, I've always found that in a garden, the most beautiful flowers often have the deepest roots, and sometimes the most poisonous ones. It's like the woodbine that choked the life out of the vicarage porch last year. It looked so innocent until the wood began to rot underneath. Mrs. Benson gave a sharp, sudden shiver and hurried away toward her cottage. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind returning to the Colonel's final gesture. He hadn't pointed at Julian Thorne, nor at his niece. He had pointed at a table of cakes, and in her pocket, the sticky, shriveled sultana seemed to grow heavier. It was a minor detail, a tiny crumb of evidence compared to the smoking gun found in Julian's briefcase, but it was the one detail that didn't fit the police's tidy narrative. And in Miss Marple's experience, it was always the detail that didn't fit that eventually brought the whole house of cards down. The police car's departure left a vacuum of silence that was quickly filled by the rhythmic snip-snip of Miss Marple's gardening shears. She was not, however, thinking of geraniums. Her mind was hovering over that single shriveled fruit currently resting on a saucer in her kitchen. To Inspector Slack, the case was a matter of finding the hand that held the bottle. To Miss Marple, it was a matter of understanding why a man would point at a fruitcake while he was dying. By midday, the village was buzzing with the news of the poison bottle found in Julian Thorne's briefcase. It was the sort of evidence that felt final, like the closing of a book, yet as Miss Marple made her way back to the parish hall, under the very plausible pretext of having left a second, purely imaginary ball of wool beneath her chair, she found herself looking not at the dais, but at the floor near the tea-urn. The hall was officially closed, but the side door was often left ajar for the cleaning woman, Mrs. Rogers. Miss Marple slipped inside, her footsteps silent on the polished wood. The yellow police tape looked garish in the midday sun. She navigated toward the table where the competition cakes still sat, now looking rather sad and stale under their protective covers. She lifted the edge of the sheet covering Mrs. Benson's entry. It was a magnificent creation, dark and rich, studded with perfectly placed sultanas and cherries, but as Miss Marple leaned closer, her sharp eyes noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible irregularity. On the very top of the cake, near the center, there was a small indentation, a crater where a single sultana had once been. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" The voice was sharp, echoing off the high ceiling. Miss Marple didn't jump. She simply turned with a look of mild, elderly confusion. Inspector Slack stood in the doorway, his thumbs hooked into his belt. "Oh, Inspector, you startled me. I was just... Well, it's a silly thing, but I couldn't help thinking about poor Mrs. Benson's cake. To have it sit here and go to waste when she worked so hard on it. It seems such a pity, doesn't it?" Slack marched forward, his boots clattering. "It's evidence, Miss Marple, or at least the table is, though it's hardly necessary now. We found the pesticide bottle in the architect's bag. Concentrated oleander extract, the lab says. It matches the residue in the Colonel's cup, open and shut. Oleander," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Such a beautiful plant, but so very treacherous. It reminds me of the time the old Admiral's daughter tried to make a herbal tea from the wrong shrub, a very painful mistake. But tell me, Inspector, did you find the bottle hidden in Mr. Thorne's bag, or was it just—" "There," Slack frowned. "It was in the side pocket. He claims he was using it for his own garden, but the timing is a bit too convenient for my liking. He and the niece were seen arguing with the Colonel just an hour before the tea. They wanted money, and the Colonel wasn't giving it. Yes, I suppose that would be the motive," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting back to the cake. "But I was wondering, did you happen to notice the sugar tongs? They were on the floor near the cup. I believe the sergeant bagged them." "The tongs?" Slack scoffed. "What about them?" "They're sugar tongs, Miss Marple. Standard parish issue." "It's just that," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "They were tipped with something dark. I thought perhaps it was tea, but then I remembered that the Colonel took his tea with sugar, but no milk. And the sugar in the bowl was white as snow, so why were the tongs stained?" Slack looked annoyed. "Probably dropped in the spill. Look, Miss Marple, I know you like to help, but we have the bottle, we have the motive, and we have the witnesses who saw the niece hand him the cup. We don't need to worry about the sugar tongs." Miss Marple nodded submissively. "Of course, Inspector, you are quite right. I'm sure it's just my old-fashioned mind wandering. It's just like the case of the village fete in St. Mary Mead. Everyone was looking at the missing prize ham, while the real clue was the fact that the vicar had 2 left-handed gloves." As Slack ushered her out of the hall, he missed the way Miss Marple's eyes lingered one last time on the floor. She wasn't looking for gloves or ham. She was looking at the path the Colonel had taken from the tea-urn to the dais. In her pocket, the sultana she had found earlier seemed to pulse with importance. She had examined it closely before leaving her cottage. It wasn't a sultana at all. It was a seed from a Nerium oleander, but it had been carefully soaked in dark, sugary syrup to make it look exactly like a piece of dried fruit. The clue wasn't the bottle in the briefcase. The bottle was far too easy to find, much like the jam jar in Tommy Bond's satchel. The real clue was the fact that someone had gone to the trouble of disguising the poison as a harmless ingredient of a competition cake. And if the poison was in the cake, why had the Colonel died from the tea? Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the green, her mind clicking through the possibilities. The pattern was shifting. It wasn't a simple case of a niece and her lover. It was something far more calculated, a crime that required not just a bottle of poison, but a deep knowledge of the village's habits, its pride, and its very specific recipes. She saw Eleanor Pendergast sitting on a bench near the war memorial, her head in her hands. The girl looked less like a murderess, and more like a bird caught in a very large, very invisible web. Miss Marple knew she needed to speak with her, but first she had a more pressing visit to make. She needed to know exactly how Mrs. Benson prepared her fruitcake, and why a single sultana would be missing from the top of it. Miss Marple's path did not lead directly to the bench where Eleanor Pendergast sat in her silent vigil of grief and confusion. Instead, she turned her steps toward the narrow, winding lane that led to Rose Cottage. She walked with the purposeful yet slow gait of a woman enjoying the morning air, but her mind was sifting through the village's history like a deck of well-worn cards. Lichgate on the Hill was a place of beautiful surfaces, but she knew that beneath the manicured lawns and the climbing roses, the soil was often sour with old resentments. As she approached the picket gate of Mrs. Benson's garden, she paused. The sound of raised voices drifted through the open lattice windows of the cottage, an unusual occurrence in a house usually as quiet as a library. "I won't have it, Julian. It's gone too far," came Mrs. Benson's voice, uncharacteristically sharp. "I did what you asked because I thought it was for the best, but a man is dead. You never said he would die." "Keep your voice down, Myra," a man's voice replied, tight with a desperate sort of authority. Miss Marple recognized the clipped modern tones of Julian Thorne. "The police are looking for a bottle. As long as you stay quiet about the—" He stopped abruptly, the sound of a latch clicking shut echoing in the garden. Miss Marple immediately began a deep, fascinated study of a nearby cluster of snapdragons. When Julian Thorne stepped out of the front door a moment later, he nearly collided with her. His face, usually so composed and professional, was flushed, and his eyes had the frantic look of a cornered animal. "Oh, Mr. Thorne," Miss Marple chirped, looking up with an expression of mild surprise. "What a coincidence. I was just coming to ask dear Myra about her recipe for fruitcake. It really was the talk of the hall yesterday, despite the tragedy." Thorne stared at her for a heartbeat, his hands clenching at his sides. "Mrs. Benson isn't feeling well, Miss Marple. I wouldn't disturb her if I were you. The shock, you understand." Of course," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "Shock is such a treacherous thing. It reminds me of poor Mr. Willoughby, the local bank manager in my own village. When his ledger didn't balance, he took to his bed for a month. Everyone thought it was his heart, but it was really just the weight of a secret he couldn't quite manage to bury. Secrets are so much heavier than stones, don't you think? Thorne's gaze sharpened, a flicker of suspicion crossing his features, but he merely nodded curtly and hurried away toward the green. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the way he avoided the main path, choosing instead the shadows of the hedgerows. She waited until he was out of sight before tapping gently on the cottage door. It was opened by Mrs. Benson, whose eyes were red-rimmed and whose hands were buried deep in the pockets of her apron. "Oh, Jane," the widow whispered, stepping back to let her in. I can't talk about the cake now. I really can't. I quite understand, Myra," Miss Marple said, settling herself into a chintz-covered armchair without being asked. The room was impeccably clean, yet there was a faint, bitter scent hanging in the air, the smell of bruised leaves and something medicinal. But I think we must talk about the Colonel. He was not a popular man, was he? Not even with those who seemed to be his friends. Mrs. Benson sank onto the sofa, her composure crumbling. He was going to take the cottages, Jane. He didn't care about tradition or resilience. He wanted to expand the village green to increase the value of the manor lands. He called our homes unsightly eyesores. He had the legal papers ready. Julian tried to stop him, tried to find a flaw in the deeds, but the Colonel wouldn't listen. "And so Julian asked you to help him?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "To perhaps distract the Colonel, or to give him a little fright?" Mrs. Benson looked up, a look of genuine terror in her eyes. He said if the Colonel felt unwell during the speech, if he had to leave the hall, Julian could get into his study at the manor and find the original deeds. He said he just needed the Colonel out of the way for an hour. He gave me the sultanas to put in my cake. He said they were just a strong emetic, something to make him feel poorly, nothing more. Miss Marple sighed, a sound of profound sadness. "Oh, Myra, it is so easy to believe what we want to believe when our homes are at stake. But the sultanas weren't emetics, were they? I found one. It was an oleander seed, carefully prepared, and Julian Thorne had a bottle of the extract in his bag. A backup, perhaps, or a way to ensure the police looked exactly where he wanted them to look." "But I didn't do it!" Mrs. Benson cried, her voice rising to a sob. "I couldn't bring myself to do it, Jane. When the time came to bake the cake, I put the seeds in a bowl, but I dropped one on the floor and panicked. I threw the rest away. I made the cake with ordinary fruit. I swear it." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the widow's face. She believed her. Mrs. Benson was many things, frightened, desperate, perhaps a bit foolish, but she was not a cold-blooded killer. "If you didn't put them in the cake, Myra," Miss Marple asked softly, "then who took the seeds from your kitchen? Because one of them was definitely at the hall yesterday. And someone used the sugar tongs to place it precisely where the Colonel would see it." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miss Marple thought of the stained sugar tongs and the Colonel's last desperate gesture. The pattern was almost complete, but there was still one thread that didn't match the rest, a thread that led away from the obvious suspects and toward a person no one had yet thought to question. Miss Marple left Rose Cottage with a heavy heart. The image of the trembling Mrs. Benson burned into her mind. The poor woman's confession had clarified one thing. There had been a conspiracy, but it was a clumsy, desperate one, born of a fear of losing one's home. Yet, as she walked back toward the village green, she found the atmosphere had shifted from somber to electric. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance to the manor, where a black police car sat with its doors agape. "It's happened again, Jane," Mrs. Price Ridley called out, her face flushed with the exertion of having hurried across the grass. She was clutching her pearls so tightly her knuckles were white. "The inspector has just come from the house. He's found more evidence, dreadful evidence. It seems the Colonel wasn't just poisoned, he was being systematically robbed." Miss Marple paused, her blue eyes narrowing. "Robbed, Clara? In what sense?" "His heart medication." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned in. her voice dropping to a theatrical stage whisper. Nurse Woods went to give the Colonel's evening dosage to the inspector for testing, and the entire bottle of digitalis was gone, replaced with nothing but sugar pills. And they found the real bottle hidden in Eleanor's knitting basket, tucked right inside a ball of baby wool she was working on for the church bazaar. This was the twist the village had been waiting for. To the local mind, the case was now doubly sealed. Not only had there been a public poisoning at the parish hall, but a secret, slower murder had been in progress behind the manor's closed doors. It painted Eleanor Pendergast as a calculating monster, a girl who had tried to weaken her uncle's heart before finally delivering the coup de grace with the tea. Miss Marple, however, felt a cold prickle of unease. It was all too neat, much like the way the legendary Mrs. Pinner had once found a missing silver spoon in the new housemaid's apron pocket, only for Miss Marple to discover that the spoon had been polished with a cloth the maid hadn't used in weeks. "A knitting basket," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "How very convenient. Eleanor is a tidy girl, isn't she, to leave such a thing in a place where any nurse or housemaid might stumble upon it?" "The inspector thinks she panicked," Mrs. Price Ridley asserted, "but that's not all. Julian Thorne has been taken to the station for further questioning. They found blueprints in his office, plans for a new housing estate on the very land the Colonel refused to sell. It seems our young architect was planning for a future that required the Colonel to be well and truly under the sod. The focus had shifted entirely. The oleander in the tea was now seen as a backup to a more prolonged attempt on the man's life. But as Miss Marple watched the inspector march Eleanor toward the police car, the girl's face a mask of frozen, silent horror, she noticed a small detail that the inspector, in his triumph, had ignored. A figure was watching the scene from the shadows of the manor's heavy oak doors. It was the district nurse, Nurse Woods. She was a woman of middle age, efficient and usually quite brisk, but at this moment she was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. It was a natural reaction to a tragedy, perhaps. But as the nurse turned to go back inside, Miss Marple noticed a peculiar hitch in her step, a slight rhythmic limp that hadn't been there the day before. Miss Marple's mind flashed back to the sultana in her pocket, and the seed Mrs. Benson had dropped on her kitchen floor. She remembered the stained sugar tongs. A new pattern was forming, one that required a very specific kind of knowledge, not just of plants or architecture, but of the internal workings of a household's medicine chest and the precise timing of a village event. "Clara," Miss Marple said suddenly, turning back to her friend. "Who was it that suggested the Colonel should have his tea brought to him on the dais, rather than him coming to the table like everyone else?" Mrs. Price Ridley frowned, trying to recall. "Why, I believe it was the nurse. She told the vicar's wife that the Colonel's heart had been playing up, and he shouldn't be made to stand in the queue. It seemed very thoughtful at the time." "Thoughtful indeed," Miss Marple whispered. She began to walk, not toward her cottage, but toward the parish hall once more. She needed to look at that leaking tea urn again. If the digitalis was the primary weapon, the oleander was the distraction, but a distraction meant to frame the architect and the niece. The true killer had played a double game, using the villagers' own gossip and the inspector's ego as the final pieces of the trap. The revelation of the missing medication hadn't simplified the case. It had revealed the killer's true face, a face hidden behind a mask of professional care. Miss Marple knew she had to move quickly. The true deception wasn't the bottle in the bag or the pills in the basket. It was the leak that had allowed a certain someone to handle the cups, long before the niece ever touched them. The sun began to dip behind the spire of St. Jude's, casting long skeletal shadows across the manor's gravel drive. As the police car carrying the sobbing Eleanor Pendergast disappeared from view, the village felt as though it had been hollowed out. Only Miss Marple remained by the stone pillars of the gate, her knitting bag clutched against her side like a shield. She watched Nurse Woods linger on the porch, a solitary figure in a crisp white uniform that seemed to glow in the twilight. With a small, determined nod to herself, Miss Marple began to walk, not away from the manor, but toward it. She moved with a slight, deliberate frailty, pausing every few steps to catch her breath. By the time she reached the porch, she looked exactly like what she wished to portray, a tired, slightly confused old lady overwhelmed by the day's excitement. "Nurse Woods? Oh, thank goodness you're still here," Miss Marple panted softly, pressing a hand to her chest. "I wonder, would it be too much trouble to ask for a glass of water? My heart, it's been fluttering quite dreadfully since they took that poor girl away." Nurse Woods turned, her face a mask of professional sympathy that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Of course, Miss Marple, come inside. You shouldn't be out in this evening chill after such a shock." She led Miss Marple into the small morning room, her movements efficient and brisk, though Miss Marple again noted the tiny rhythmic hitch in her gait, a subtle flinch as the nurse put weight on her right foot. As the water was poured, Miss Marple settled into a chair, her eyes roaming the room. On the side table sat the Colonel's empty medicine tray, a silent witness to a routine that had been fatally interrupted. "It's the digitalis, I suppose," Miss Marple said, taking the glass with a trembling hand. "The inspector mentioned it to Mrs. Price Ridley. Such a powerful drug. It reminds me of poor Mr. Spenlow's sister. She was a nurse too, you know. She always said that the difference between a cure and a corpse was simply a matter of a few grains." Nurse Woods stiffened almost imperceptibly as she sat opposite her. "It is a dangerous responsibility, Miss Marple, one I took very seriously with the Colonel. To think that his own niece would swap his tablets, it's beyond comprehension." "Yes, the police are very certain," Miss Marple agreed, her voice thin and airy. "They found the bottle in the knitting, you see. It's like the case of the village postmaster. Everyone looked in the safe, but the stolen stamps were actually hidden inside the glue pot. People always hide things where they feel most comfortable. For a girl like Eleanor, a knitting basket is home. But for someone else, well, someone else might find the back of a tea urn much more convenient." The nurse's hand, which had been smoothing a crease in her apron, went still. "The tea urn? I don't follow." "Oh, it's just a silly old woman's observation," Miss Marple chirped, leaning forward as if sharing a confidence. "I noticed at the hall that the urn was leaking. It made such a mess on the tablecloth. And I remembered how you so kindly offered to help Mrs. Danvers wipe it up. It gave you such a lovely opportunity to handle the cups before Eleanor ever arrived. And then there's the matter of the sultana I found on the floor." Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced the small, sticky seed, holding it up between her thumb and forefinger like a prize. "It isn't a fruit at all, you see. It's an oleander seed soaked in dark syrup. It looks exactly like the fruit in Mrs. Benson's cake. Now, Julian Thorne had the extract, but he didn't have the seeds. Mrs. Benson said she threw hers away. But you, nurse, you spent so much time in the manor gardens, and the Colonel was so very proud of his oleanders." Nurse Woods gave a short, cold laugh. "Are you suggesting I poisoned the Colonel? I, who have cared for him for 3 years. Why would I do such a thing?" "Perhaps because you cared for him too well," Miss Marple said, her voice suddenly losing its tremulous edge. It was now steady, cold, and profoundly insightful. "The Colonel was a difficult man, but he was also a man of habit. He had promised you a legacy in his will, hadn't he, a very generous one for faithful service. But then he decided to sell the land and change the will to benefit the parish hall. If he died before the new will was signed, which was supposed to happen tomorrow, you would still inherit, and you knew Julian Thorne and Eleanor were the perfect scapegoats. Julian's temper and Eleanor's romance provided all the poison the police would ever need." The nurse stood up, her face pale. "This is monstrous. You have no proof. The police found the bottle in Eleanor's basket." "Indeed they did," Miss Marple said gently. "But they didn't look at the ball of wool very closely. I noticed it when the inspector carried it out. It was wound in a very particular way, a way that Eleanor, who is a traditional knitter, never uses. It was wound like a surgical bandage, a habit of the hand, you see. We all have them. Just as you have the habit of limping slightly on your right foot ever since you stepped on the thorn of a certain oleander bush while gathering those seeds in the dark. A silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Nurse Woods didn't move. She stared at Miss Marple, the mask of the helpful village nurse finally beginning to crack, revealing the cold, calculating desperation beneath. Miss Marple didn't flinch, she simply waited, her pale blue eyes watching the internal struggle of a woman who had thought herself much cleverer than a village spinster. "You think you're so wise," the nurse hissed, her voice a low, jagged rasp, but he was a hateful man. He was going to throw us all away, me, the servants, even his own flesh and blood, for a name on a stone building. He deserved to feel his heart fail him. "It is not for us to decide who deserves to live, Myra." "Oh, I'm sorry, I mean Nurse Woods," Miss Marple corrected herself with a polite, ruthless smile. "But I think the inspector will be very interested in that little scratch on your foot, and perhaps the residue of syrup still clinging to the inside of your medical bag." The silence in the morning room was brittle, a glass wall that shattered the moment Inspector Slack burst back through the front door, alerted by the vicar, whom Miss Marple had strategically stationed near the garden gate. The inspector looked from the rigid, defiant nurse to the serene, knitting-bag-wielding Miss Marple, his frustration warring with a sudden dawning curiosity. "What's this, then?" Slack barked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "I've got Thorn in a cell and the girl in the car. What more could you possibly have to say, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple rose slowly, her movements graceful despite the hour, only that the pattern was backwards, Inspector. You were looking at a portrait of a murder, but the artist was someone you hadn't even invited to the gallery. She gestured toward Nurse Woods, who had sunk back into a chair, her eyes fixed on the empty medicine tray. It was a very clever piece of theatre. The oleander in the tea was never meant to be the cause of death. It was meant to be the announcement of a crime. The inspector frowned, beckoning Sergeant Miller to stand by the door. "Explain yourself." "The lab found oleander extract in the cup. The colonel died of a heart attack induced by a toxic substance." "A toxic substance, yes," Miss Marple agreed, her voice clear and authoritative. "But not the one in the tea. You see, Inspector, the colonel took his tea with sugar. The nurse, knowing his habits perfectly, used the sugar tongs to place a single syrup-soaked oleander seed into his cup before Eleanor ever touched it. It was a visual cue, a sultana that didn't belong. When the colonel saw it, he didn't drink the poison, he saw the threat. The shock of realizing someone was trying to kill him, combined with the fact that his actual heart medication had been replaced with sugar pills for the last 3 days, was what truly killed him. But the extract in the cup? Slack protested. "Placed there after the fact in the confusion," Miss Marple said gently. While everyone was looking at the body, the nurse helped clear the tea service. She had the bottle, the same one she had stolen from Julian Thorne's briefcase earlier that morning. She knew he kept it for his garden, and she knew exactly where to plant it later to ensure he was blamed. It's like the case of the village blacksmith's daughter. She didn't steal the locket, she simply moved it from the jewelry box to the laundry basket, knowing exactly whose hands would be found there. Nurse Woods looked up then, her face a pale, sharp mask of resentment. He was a tyrant. He treated everyone like cattle. He was going to leave me with nothing after years of scrubbing his floors and enduring his temper. Why should Julian Thorne inherit the land for his projects or Eleanor get her freedom, while I was sent away with a pittance? "So you replaced the digitalis," Slack said, his voice dropping as he signaled Miller to take out the handcuffs. "You let his heart weaken, then gave him a final terrifying shock." "It was the sugar tongs," Miss Marple added, looking at the inspector with a touch of pity. They were stained with the syrup used to coat the seeds. "And the ball of wool, if you unwrap it, Inspector, I believe you will find the nurse's own fingerprints on the true digitalis bottle, hidden beneath layers of yarn that Eleanor hadn't touched in weeks. A nurse's hands are trained to wrap firmly, evenly, quite unlike the loose decorative tension of a young girl's knitting." As the sergeant stepped forward, Nurse Woods didn't struggle. She seemed to collapse into herself, the cold fire of her indignation extinguished by the clinical reality of the law. As she was led out into the night, the heavy manor doors seemed to sigh with relief. Inspector Slack stood for a moment in the center of the room, looking at Miss Marple. He opened his mouth to offer a gruff word of thanks, perhaps even an admission of his own haste. But Miss Marple was already busy smoothing the artificial rose on her hat. "It's the small things, Inspector," she said, her voice returning to its familiar gentle lilt, "the way a person wraps a bandage, or the way a seed looks when it's been soaked in sugar. We all have our little ways, don't we? And in a village like Lichgate, those ways are the only things that truly matter in the end." She turned toward the door, her task finished. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I really must see about poor Eleanor. I believe she'll be needing a very strong, very ordinary cup of tea, with no sugar at all, I think." The morning sun of the following Friday broke over Lichgate on the hill with a clarity that seemed to wash away the lingering shadows of the week's grim events. On the village green, the children were once again playing near the war memorial, and the heavy, oppressive silence that had hung over the parish hall had been replaced by the cheerful, mundane sounds of Mrs. Rogers' mop bucket. Order, as it always did in such places, was being restored, though the texture of the village life had been irrevocably altered. Miss Marple sat on her favourite bench, the one positioned perfectly to catch the warmth of the light and the gentle movement of the villagers. Her knitting needles were busy on a pair of soft blue booties, the wool a striking contrast to the dark, sombre colours she had worn during the investigation. Beside her, the vicar stood with his hat in his hand, looking out over his parish with a mixture of relief and profound melancholy. "It is hard to believe, Jane," the vicar said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen the darker side of his flock. "Nurse Woods, she was so dedicated. To think that beneath that professional exterior lay such a cold, calculating resentment. It makes one wonder if we ever truly know our neighbours." Miss Marple paused her knitting, her gaze following a butterfly as it danced over a cluster of lavender. "Human nature is a very strange thing, Vicar. It's like a garden, very beautiful on the surface, but if you dig just an inch or two down, you find all sorts of things working in the dark. It reminds me so much of the old gardener at the Hall back home, a man who grew the most exquisite lilies, yet spent his nights brooding over a perceived slight from 40 years ago. It's the small, quiet grievances that grow the deepest roots." The vicar sighed. "At least justice has been served. Eleanor and Julian, well, they were at the station this morning. I believe they've gone to the coast for a few days to escape the gossip. It will take time for the village to forget, but I suspect they will find their way back to one another." "I'm sure they will," Miss Marple replied with a small, knowing smile. "Adversity is a very strong glue for young hearts, and they have been cleared of all suspicion, which is the most important thing. Even Inspector Slack had to admit, in his own rather gruff way, that he had been a bit impulsive." As the vicar moved on to attend to his duties, Miss Marple remained on the bench, her thoughts drifting back to the manor. She thought of Nurse Woods, not with malice, but with a quiet, detached pity. The woman had been destroyed by her own pride, convinced that she was the only one who truly understood the Colonel Esworth, and then consumed by the realization that he saw her as nothing more than a functional part of his estate. It was a tragedy of ego played out with seeds and sugar. Mrs. Price Ridley approached then, her pace brisk and her expression one of high-octane curiosity. She settled onto the bench with a flourish of her silk scarf. "Well, Jane, I suppose you're quite the hero of the hour. The butcher says they'll likely name a new cake after you at the next fete. Though I must say, I always had my doubts about that nurse." There was something in the way she starched her collars, far too rigid for a truly kind soul. Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I don't think I'm a hero, Clara. I'm just an old woman who notices things. People are so very much the same everywhere, you see, whether it's a missing thimble in St. Mary Mead or a murder in Lichgate. The motives are always remarkably consistent. Love, hate, or money. Usually money, I'm afraid." She looked down at her knitting, the blue wool forming a perfect, orderly pattern. The case was closed. The sultana was now a piece of evidence in a police locker, and the oleander bushes in the manor garden would no doubt be pruned back or removed entirely by the next owner. The village would return to its whispers, its tea parties, and its small, harmless rivalries. "Are you leaving us soon, Jane?" Mrs. Price Ridley asked, a hint of genuine regret in her voice. "I think so, dear," Miss Marple said, tucking her wool away into her bag. "My nephew Raymond is expecting me back, and I believe my own garden needs a bit of attention. The bindweed is particularly aggressive this time of year, and if one doesn't keep an eye on it, it can choke the life out of the most beautiful roses." She rose from the bench, her movements slow but sure. As she walked toward the station, she looked back one last time at the village green. It was a picture of peace, a masterpiece of English composure. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that behind every lace curtain and every stone wall, there was a story, sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter, but always, inevitably, human. And as the train pulled into the station, she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, for a little while at least, the whispers behind the green were once again nothing more than the harmless rustle of the wind. The rhythmic chugging of the steam engine provided a soothing backdrop to Miss Marple's reflections as she settled into the corner seat of a first-class carriage. Lichgate on the hill was already receding into the distance, its spire a mere needlepoint against the horizon. She had her knitting out, a fresh skein of pale grey wool this time, but her eyes remained fixed on the passing hedgerows. The train was not yet crowded, and for a moment she was alone with the ghosts of the Pendergast manor. The carriage door slid open with a sharp rattle, and a man in a heavy overcoat stepped in, puffing slightly. It was Inspector Slack. He looked ruffled, his usual air of brisk efficiency dampened by the lingering paperwork of a high-profile arrest. He sat opposite her, placing a leather briefcase on his knees. "I thought I might find you here, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat with a begrudging respect. "I wanted to let you know. We've finished the search of the nurse's quarters. You were right about the fingerprints on the digitalis bottle, but we found something else, something that doesn't quite go into the official report, but I thought you'd want to know, seeing as you have an interest in these things." Miss Marple tucked a loose strand of grey hair behind her ear. "How very kind of you, Inspector. Is it about the Colonel's past? I always suspected there was a reason Nurse Woods was so specifically targeted for that position." Slack opened his briefcase and pulled out a small, yellowed photograph. It showed a younger Colonel Pendergast, looking remarkably handsome and significantly less purple, standing beside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the nurse. "It's her mother," Slack explained. "It seems the faithful service the Colonel mentioned in his will wasn't just for the nurse. 25 years ago, he had a very different kind of relationship with her mother. He'd promised to look after her, promised her a life of comfort, and then, well, he did what men like that often do. He married for money and position, and he left the girl with nothing but a bitter memory and a daughter she couldn't afford to raise." Miss Marple took the photograph, her expression one of deep, sorrowful understanding. So, it wasn't just about the land or the modern will. It was a long-deferred payment for a debt of the heart. The nurse didn't just stumble into that household, she sought it out. She spent years waiting for a promise that was never intended for her, but for a woman long since gone. She'd been poisoning his mind long before she touched his medicine, Slack remarked, his voice unusually quiet. She made sure he felt isolated, made sure he saw his niece as a threat to his control. She was playing a very long game, Miss Marple. The parish hall renovation and the change of the will were just the final catalysts. It is a classic case of the wronged handmaid, Miss Marple murmured, handing the photograph back. It reminds me so much of the business with the old apothecary in Nether Addington. He'd treated his assistant like a son for decades, only for the boy to realize he was actually the apothecary's unacknowledged nephew. The resentment didn't come from the labor, but from the lie. We can endure a great deal of hardship, Inspector, but we cannot endure being told we are nothing by the people who owe us everything. The train slowed as it approached a junction, the screech of the brakes echoing through the carriage. Slack stood up, snapping his briefcase shut. Well, I'll be getting off here. Forensics wants a final word on the syrup residue. I don't suppose I'll be seeing you in Lichgate again. I think not, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. The village will heal, as villages do. Eleanor and Julian will rebuild the hall, properly this time, I hope, and the shadow of the Colonel will eventually fade. But it is a pity about the sultana cake. It really was a very fine entry. As Slack stepped out onto the platform, Miss Marple watched him go. She thought of the nurse, now sitting in a cold cell, finally free of the burden of her mother's ghost, but bound by the chains of her own vengeance. It was the ultimate irony. In her quest to reclaim what she felt was hers, she had lost the only thing the Colonel could never take from her, her character. A young woman entered the carriage then, carrying a crying infant. She looked harried and exhausted, struggling with a heavy diaper bag. Without a word, Miss Marple reached out, her face breaking into a warm, grandmotherly smile. "May I help you with that, dear? And perhaps a little bit of wool for the little one to hold. My nephew always used to say that there's nothing like a soft bit of blue to quiet a restless soul." As she moved to assist the stranger, the sharp, ruthless detective of the manor was gone, replaced once more by the dithering, kind-hearted spinster of St. Mary Mead. But beneath the clicking of her needles and the soft cooing to the babe, Jane Marple's mind remained as sharp as a razor, already scanning the new faces in the carriage, looking for the tiny, discordant notes that whispered the eternal truths of the human heart. The mystery of Lichgate was over, but the world was full of villages, and every village had its green, and every green had its secrets. The journey ended, as all journeys eventually do, at the small familiar station of St. Mary Mead. The station master, a man whose family had lived in the village as long as the church had stood, tipped his cap to Miss Marple as she stepped onto the platform. The air here was different, less charged with the sharp acidic tension of Lichgate and more redolent of damp earth and the impending scent of evening jasmine. "Good to have you back, Miss Marple," the station master remarked, reaching for her small suitcase. "The village hasn't been quite the same without you. Mrs. Higgins' cat got stuck in the belfry again, and the vicar's been looking quite lost in the post office." "Thank you, Simmons. It is very good to be home," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft with a genuine affection for the mundane. She walked slowly toward her cottage, her sensible shoes clicking against the pavement. As she passed the gate of the old hall, she noticed that the gardener was busy clearing a patch of ground that had been overrun by ground elder. It was a relentless weed, one that looked quite harmless with its white, lacy flowers, yet possessed a root system so invasive it could starve the most robust perennials. It was exactly like the resentment she had seen in Nurse Woods, a quiet, creeping thing that had, eventually, choked the life out of everything it touched. When she reached her own garden gate, she paused. The bindweed she had mentioned to Mrs. Price Ridley was indeed there, winding its pale, strangling tentacles around her prized climbing roses. She would have to deal with it tomorrow, For tonight, she simply wanted the comfort of her own hearth. Inside the cottage, the air was cool and still. Her maid, Cherry, had left a small tray ready by the window, a clean teapot, a single cup, and a plate with a few plain digestive biscuits. There was no fruitcake. Miss Marple felt a small, fleeting pang of regret as she looked at the empty plate. The competition in Lichgate had been such a display of skill and pride, and it was a tragedy that it would now be remembered only for the man who died among the crumbs. She sat in her high-backed armchair, the grey wool of her latest project resting in her lap. The evening light was fading, turning the garden outside into a landscape of shadows and silver. Her mind, however, was still vivid with the images of the past few days, the Colonel's purple face, Julian Thorne's frantic eyes, and Eleanor's silent, frozen shock. A letter sat on the side table, forwarded by the Vicar of Lichgate. She opened it with a steady hand. It was from Eleanor. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, the handwriting shaky but clear. "Julian and I are away by the sea. The police have released him, and the inspector has been surprisingly apologetic. We wanted to thank you. Without your fancies, as the sergeant called them, I don't know where we would be. We are planning to sell the manor. It's too full of ghosts now, and the land will be turned into a park for the village, just as the Colonel once promised my mother it would be. We think he would have wanted that, in the end, if he had been a kinder man." Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it carefully in her desk. It was a hopeful ending, yet she couldn't help but reflect on the cost. The nurse's life was ruined, the Colonel was dead, and a village's peace had been shattered, all because of a secret kept for 25 years. It was the great tragedy of human existence, she thought, the way people clung to their grievances as if they were treasures, only to find they had become poisons. She picked up her knitting needles once more. Click, click, click. The sound was a heartbeat, a reminder that life went on, regardless of the dramas that unfolded in parish halls or manor houses. She thought of the young mother on the train and the heavy diaper bag. Life was a constant cycle of mending and breaking, of planting and weeding. "One does what one can," she whispered to the empty room, "but the roots go so very deep." She looked out the window as the first star appeared in the darkening sky. St. Mary Mead was asleep, or pretending to be. Behind the closed doors of the cottages there were no doubt other secrets, small jealousies over prize marrows, ancient disputes over property lines, and perhaps even a few lingering heartbreaks. She would listen to them all in due time. She would notice the missing spoons, the misplaced letters, and the tiny discordant notes in the village gossip. For now, however, Jane Marple was content. She poured her tea, the steam rising in a gentle, fragrant cloud. It was a very ordinary cup of tea, made with nothing but boiling water and few leaves. It was simple, honest, and entirely free of bitterness. And in a world where shadows always lurked behind the village green, that, she decided, was quite enough.